I should say that recently I did a conversation with Avital Ronell for a journal on a special issue on post-truth. And what I did for this paper is simply take my half of it and turn it from a conversation into a mini argument, right? So that's where this is coming from. And it also is in honor, by the way, of the 50th anniversary of the uprisings in Paris.
That's right.
All right. In 2006, Merriam-Webster's word of the year was truthiness. Stephen Colbert's playfully coined to describe this term. Sorry, let me start again. The term Stephen Colbert playfully coined to describe or decry a phenomenon of feeling truth in the gut or the heart rather than thinking it with the head. Embracing the flip side of the familiar mind-body split, truthiness is all about the feels, about committing to something that feels true despite other evidence to the contrary. A decade later, Oxford dictionaries chose post-truth as their 2016 word of the year, defining it as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping personal opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. Though Colbert complained that post-truth is just a ripoff of truthiness, they're not quite synonymous. Rather, as Amy B. Wang puts it, truthiness cleared a path for post-truth, as in a post-truth world, truthiness is all that matters. What defines a post-truth world then is that pathos trumps logos. That seems to be the general consensus, whether you're crushed or heartened by it. I heard former Republican Representative Jack Kingston gleefully explain on CNN, for example, that the Republican base is unmoved by evidence that Trump lies because Americans are embracing a new sense of truth that's tied not to observable facts, but to the feel of the overall direction of a movement. Of course, it remains commonplace to depict as irrational those who don't feel the same truth or the same commitment to the direction of this movement. Almost daily, @Real Donald Trump tweets that the Russia investigation is a witch hunt, for example. Witch hunt mentality is, of course, what the scientific revolution and Enlightenment thinking tried to check. Positioning himself as a feminized witch being hunted, he plays both sides of a traditionally gendered Enlightenment psychodrama. But let's come back to the question of enlightenment and of reason, and of the possibility of an enlightenment of reason. Let's start by noting the pileup already of problematic presumptions, that any of this really qualifies as new, that the relation between body and mind is oppositional, that pathos and logos are discrete, detachable rhetorical appeals, that truth was ever reducible to something like objective facts, and so on. And what exactly is the post meant to denote? I mean, post-objectivity, maybe, or even post-veracity, but post-truth? Whether one aims to conceal, reveal, manipulate, or just somehow come to grips with it, truth will not be pinned down. It both insists and resists, defying definitive localization and complete stabilization. Neither simply relative and dependent on human consciousness, nor merely objective and out there, looming. Truth bears a spectral and so irreducible character, the disseminated remains of which will not be sidelined or triumphantly consigned to the rearview mirror. There are potentially calamitous risks confronting us today under the label post-truth. However, and this is my only real point tonight, I don't think insisting on the objective status of truth will have been an effective or responsive response to them. What I'll try to indicate here is that these perilous risks also expose an ethical structuring that is the very condition for any democratic being together. But each time the authorizing power of objective truth is reasserted, this ethical structuring is effaced and the democratic chance it offers is hijacked. This is a chance that does not and could not come without risk. Among other things, post-truth is associated with a felt breakdown or takedown of authority, which, as Avital Ronell writes, is reducible neither to persuasion nor force. Here's Ronell. Unlike neighboring syntagms of power, such as those attached to tyranny and injustice, about which examples abound, indeed overflow and cramp, authority is difficult to track, impossible to monitor, discouragingly complicated to talk about. Arendt puts authority on the opposing side of any rhetoric of persuasion. Authority disdains the egalitarian order of persuasion, having little use for the petition of strategically aligned language acts. Standing rigorously on its own, it refuses simple power alliances. Thus, it contradicts both coercion by force and persuasion through arguments. You can't talk to it, submit it to any logic, or talk your way out of the troubled facticity of a standoff with authority. Tyranny and injustice are on display everywhere today, of course, but what the label post-truth tries to grapple with, I'll venture, has something to do with the felt withdrawal of authority. It's no longer possible even to pretend that ethico-political deliberations and decisions are underpinned by shared identifications with substantial, and let's face it, mostly paternal figures of authority. God, King, Father, the President, the nation, our democracy, science, the law, the New York Times, the CIA, the FBI, all such authorizing figures of divinely inspired, or empirically discovered truth are openly suspect today. The panicked response to this withdrawal of authority, though it has never not been withdrawing, is due in large part, as Ronell demonstrates, to the widespread and long-standing conviction that authority is what protects against societal dissolution. From Martin Luther's hysterical speculation that authority must exist, for otherwise worldly order would collapse, to Lacan's concession that paternal authority finally is possibly better than nothing, though one is the worse for it. In the works of Arendt, Kojève, and nearly all their uncited sources, Ronell suggests, the world, like a dramatic figure threatening suicide, menaces with ending it all if authority's hold were to weaken. Since Brexit and the 2016 US presidential election, mostly left-leaning commentators and bloggers have been repeating this refrain while pointing an accusing finger at postmodern thought, which they blame for undermining the validity of objective truth and facts, and therefore their respective figures of authority. The New Republic, the New York Times, Salon.com, The Guardian, The Atlantic, and The New Yorker, for instance, have run pieces accusing postmodernists of creating the conditions for a post-truth era. In this context, apparently, postmodernist is meant to cartoon a wildly diverse array of continental theorists, from Jean Baudrillard to Martin Heidegger or Theodore Adorno, but mostly zeroing in on a generation of French thinkers, Foucault, Deleuze, Lyotard, Levinas, Lacan, and, of course, Derrida. The Christian blog Mere Orthodoxy got very specific, running a piece called Blame Jacques Derrida for Donald Trump, which claims that deconstruction is the reason Americans no longer share a reality, culturally speaking. Staunch atheist and American philosopher Daniel Dennett finds rare common ground with the Christians on this one, stating in an interview with The Guardian, quote, "I think what the postmodernists did was truly evil. They are responsible for the intellectual fad that made it respectable to be cynical about truth and facts." Wherever there are competing narratives, Dennett insists, one of those narratives is the truth and the others aren't. It's as simple as that. And though he says he begrudges every moment of it, he feels he must engage in political activity today to help fend off disaster by reestablishing the authority of particularly scientific facts. In Loser Sons, Ronell takes a decidedly different tack. Acknowledging that the inevitable withdrawal of authority does risk the worst, making way for various forms of authoritarianism, Ronell suggests that this withdrawal may also bear the gift or chance of another democracy, a democracy that might, she writes alongside Jean-Luc Nancy, affirm itself as a non-figural opening for the incalculable that escapes political determination. This perilous opening that leaves us utterly exposed, again, to the worst, Ronell and Nancy are suggesting, is also the condition for a democratic being together irreducible to any putatively shared reality. As Nancy puts it in The Truth of Democracy, democracy is not figurable. Better, it's not by essence figural. This is perhaps the only sense in the end that can be given to it. It overthrows the assumption of the figuration of a destiny, of a truth of the common. But it imposes the configuration of common space in a way that opens up the greatest possible proliferation of forms that the infinite can take, figures of our affirmations and declarations of our desires. Democracy, he's saying, by definition affirms a being together not tethered to the fantasy of identification, capital I. Here, small I identification still has its run, Ronell observes, but without substantial backup or recognizable goalpost. This means that the task of democratic politics would not be to restore or introduce some new figure or agency of authority on which to ground shared reality or common truth. It would indeed be to secure the opening or the breach that, while risking everything, allows for the limitless proliferation of singular and unsubstitutable expressions of being together whose incalculable value could not be measured in advance by the authorizing truth of a given system or standard of equivalence. Democratic politics, Nancy writes, renounces giving itself a figure. It allows for a proliferation of figures, figures affirmed, invented, created, imagined, and so on. Its job is to open the space for multiple identities and for their sharing out, but it is not up to it to give itself a figure. That, he notes, is what political courage today must learn to acknowledge. Perhaps our best hope for fending off disaster, in other words, would be to learn to think and identify with a generative but non-figural democratic authority, which sustains this opening only by renouncing authorizing figures, to learn to affirm the democratic non-equivalence, to use Nancy's phrasing, that is exposed in the felt withdrawal of metaphysical foundations, not to restore or lay down some new foundation, but to relinquish foundations. This would include even those presumptive foundations that claim to be moral. According to Immanuel Kant, for example, what holds social order together is the authority not of truth or of facts, but very specifically of veracity, of truth-telling, which is for him the unconditional moral principle. You have an absolute moral duty to tell what you believe to be the truth, he says, even if assassins show up at your door asking for your guest. Kant has a zero-tolerance policy for lies, we might say. You can't lie ever, even if your guest ends up getting whacked for it, because lying for any purpose performatively declares that declarations in general are unreliable, which undermines all rights based on contract. Condoning even benevolent lies, he argues, will erode the very fabric of the social bond, and so rights in general, which rest on the presumption of veracity. A preliminary faith, let's acknowledge, that testifies to the very opening or breach that makes lying possible in the first place. Veracity is, for Kant, the unconditional duty that grounds all duties, and lying, even a little, even to assassins, and so let's extrapolate, even to the SS, even to ICE, would commit a wrong against duty generally and against humankind generally. But in positioning veracity as an absolute moral duty, what Kant ends up doing is releasing me from my responsibility to make urgent ethical decisions, somehow to act in the face of the undecidable and for the sake of radically non-equivalent and unsubstitutable singularities. Kant, too, then, hopes to protect society, to hold it together by encasing it, patching up the unpatchable opening on which democratic ethics and justice depend. The aim of any zero-tolerance crackdown, whether ethical or political, is to assert some ultimate authority at which the buck stops, where this risky breach is finally sealed. As you know, the Trump administration recently invoked the absolute authority of the law and of its enforcement agencies to sidestep the gut-wrenching ethical decisions demanded at the U.S.-Mexico border. And the drama of authorities' withdrawal ensued. Enforcing this new zero-tolerance policy meant yanking migrant children, including infants and toddlers, from their parents, many of whom were fleeing unthinkable atrocities in Central America. And when even some Trump-thumping white evangelical Christians balked at this policy's hard-boiled ruthlessness, Attorney General Jeff Sessions tried to bolster its authority by throwing God behind it, citing the infamous Romans 13 passage. That didn't go well. White House Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders then tried to throw the White House behind Sessions, and that didn't go well either. I mean, obviously.
I can say that it is very biblical to enforce the law. That is actually repeated a number of times throughout the Bible.
An international explosion of public outrage eventually forced the administration to tweak the policy, only a tweak, to be continued. And it's unclear if this outrage will morph into the kind of political courage for which Nancy calls. However, if a truly democratic polity is to have any chance at all, I'm arguing, it'll be thanks to this withdrawal of authorizing figures, along with the shared reality they aim to impose. I want to be as clear as possible here. I am not advocating for lawlessness. But if there is a justice beyond the law, a truly democratic justice, it will remain irreducible to the authorizing power of any law. This other democracy that we're trying to talk about, a democracy to come that protects the opening and is not tethered to the fantasy of identification, still involves thinking, reasoning, calculating, deciding, but without any absolute guarantee on which to ground thought or action, without the assurance of any authorizing figure, any determinate truth, uncontestable fact, or sacred moral principle. And with all due respect to Daniel Dennett, without any scientific assurances. Given the absolutely soul-crushing anti-science discourses grounding legislation on everything from women's reproductive health to climate change, many of us now feel an urgent responsibility to defend science. But let's admit that it's complicated. The menacing calculations driving biopolitics today spring from an intense intersection of science and neoliberalism, where, to echo Nietzsche, the wasteland grows. In the test drive, Ronell maps out a history of philosophy's breakups and makeups with science, noting that the former often finds it necessary to drop the latter over its propensity for delusions of self-sufficiency, which is to say, its objectivism. Nietzsche was amazed by science, she notes, but a reactive tendency to reduce itself to calculative efficacy also lands it squarely in his repertoire of illusions, dissembling interpretations, and masks. As we all know, scientific discoveries about race and gender have given cover to brutally unjust social and political policies, too numerous to name. Nonetheless, science at its best, science without scientism, opens toward futurity, in some cases boldly interrupting capitalist, humanist, masculinist politics as usual with evidence from elsewhere and to the contrary. It's closely allied to poetic speculation and reflection, trying somehow, as Ronell puts it in our conversation, to recruit a splinter of so-called reality to produce certain hypothetical solidities on which we rely, but with the understanding that cognition or knowledge belongs to a will to power, which is also a will to fiction. Science at its best, science in the service of truth, we could say, embraces truth's unmasterability and acknowledges its own poetic surges and lurches and aberrations. It knows how fabulous and necessarily flimsy its foundations are, Ronell continues, and nonetheless it takes all sorts of risks building on them. Any logic knows it's being recruited to snuff out all kinds of deviations that can't be accounted for, all kinds of unaccountables and incalculables. Like that. There are dimensions of so-called reality that neither consciousness nor memory can bear, and that neither science nor mathematics nor phenomenology could master. What we call reality infinitely escapes any calculative grid, creating blind spots and sometimes shocking, traumatic, stuporous darkness or joy when, for example, you don't understand your own desire or the desire of the other. So it's not a question, a la Dennett, of reestablishing the authority of scientific facts, but of how to advocate for science today without resorting to regressive claims about objective truth or promoting Platonic assumptions about some always prior reality and its authentic representation. How to acknowledge the frequent predictive success of medical, forensic, climate, and other sciences, for example, without returning to pre-deconstructive notions of truth and reality. One thing the diverse thinkers clumsily lumped today under the label postmodernist do have in common is that they acknowledge that there is no stable ground for thought or utterance. However, they are not mouthpieces for idiotic anything-goes slogans about all truth being relative. Deconstruction, for example, passionately devotes itself to another sort of truth, never simply determinate or verifiable, but haunting, spectral, irreducible. We might call it a truth of the remains. Deconstruction traces the self-effacing remainder that constitutes any identity formation, any apparently stable truth, aiming to expose and hold open the irreparable opening that does risk the worst, while also giving futurity its chance. Derrida associates this truth with a post-Kantian enlightenment to come. Jean-Luc Nancy called it a post-romantic enlightenment. This enlightenment to come would not be without reason or calculation, but it would remain irreducible to both. Or, as Derrida writes, it would involve a certain future or to come of reason that resists the teleological unity of reason. We're talking about the enlightenment of a reason that would no longer neutralize the unforeseeable and the incalculable eruption, the singular and exceptional alterity of what comes, or indeed of who comes, Derrida writes. This is a reason that would welcome and remain open to the opening that makes reason itself possible. This is a very, let's say, modest notion of enlightenment, which Derrida aligns with deconstruction, and which gets its only light by sticking with the destinerance of the trace, which is to say by meticulously tracking the unpredictable, self-effacing, and resolutely unpinnable relations that are the condition for any identity formation, any observable or historical fact, any specific truth claim. The truth that deconstruction doggedly tracks entails the general spectrality of the trace, the haunting of any apparently present presence by the not simply present others, the not its that are its condition and of which it bears a trace. Whatever comes at us in terms of empirically verifiable data brings along suppressed ghostly formations to which deconstruction remains attuned and which can come back with a vengeance or as a promise at any time. This extraordinarily modest enlightenment assumes a quasi-ontological orientation, in other words, that understands itself to be grounded in nothing more primary or more enduring than the undeconstructible movement of protension and retention, an originary relation between referral and identity, the genetic and psychic mattering of which grants all history, Derrida writes in Of Grammatology, from what metaphysics has defined as non-living up to consciousness, passing through all levels of animal organization. An enlightenment to come is oriented by this fundamental, undeclinable, and ana-human obligation or desire as clinamen, as drive, to respond to the trace of the other. And its slivers of light are promised only via probes and queries that refuse to stop at the borders of the merely empirical or the simply observable. In The History of the Lie, Derrida cites a 1943 piece by Alexandre Koyré called The Political Function of the Modern Lie, which begins, "Never has there been so much lying as in our day. Never has lying been so shameless, so systematic, so unceasing. Hannah Arendt repeats this sentiment more than 2 decades later in Truth and Politics in 1967, and again in Lying and Politics in 1971. And of course, the point of claiming today that we're in a post-truth world is to insist again that something very new has happened to us, some unprecedented twist or rupture in our relation to truth. But let me quote Derrida quoting Coiré for reasons I hope will be clear. Again, this is 1943. The official philosophies of the totalitarian regimes unanimously brand as nonsensical the idea that there exists a single objective truth valid for everybody. The criterion of truth, they say, is not agreement with reality, but agreement with the spirit of a race or a nation or a class, that is, racial, national, or utilitarian. Pushing to their limits the biological, pragmatist, activist theories of truth, the official philosophies of the totalitarian regimes deny the inherent value of thought. For them, thought is not a light, but a weapon. Its function, they say, is not to discover reality as it is, but to change and transform it with the purpose of leading us toward what it is not. Such being the case, myth is better than science, and rhetoric that works on the passions preferable to proof that appeals to the intellect. Close quote. Derrida grants that we must vigilantly guard against the danger Coiré is denouncing. But what he wants to show is that both totalitarian philosophies and Coiré's anti-totalitarian critique of them invoke the same dichotomous relation between, on the one hand, a single objective truth valid for everybody, and on the other, activist theories of truth that push racial, national, or utilitarian agendas. What Coiré is denouncing is not simply the biological and the official philosophies of totalitarianism, Derrida writes, but everything that exceeds in more than one direction the determination of truth as objectivity, as the theme of a constitutive utterance, or even as adequation. At the limit, it touches on any consideration of performative utterances. Testimony, promise, and oath are caught up in this sweep, as is any problematic that delimits, questions, and/or deconstructs the authority of truth as objective, or objectivity, or as adequation, or even as revelation. This either-or script has been stuck on infinite replay, with both totalitarian and anti-totalitarian positions dutifully flipping the privilege from one side of the presumed dichotomy to another. In response to what Kingston now depicts as a new sense of truth that is not tied to observable facts, but to the feel of the direction of a movement, we get the also totalizing move of reducing truth once again to objective facts that are stable and verifiable, and so the righteous indignation aimed at evil postmodernists. It seems to me crucial that we learn to think a truth that is as irreducible to racial, national, or utilitarian impulses as it is to objectivist and positivist impulses, to affirm and embrace a truth that by definition will not be pinned down, that is not simply relative, but that does exceed any politics of foundation or of authority. It's risky. But assuming this risk may also be the first step toward welcoming a democratic non-equivalence, and so our best hope of fending off disaster. Thank you.